Somebody's calling my name. O Lord, what shall I do? We are in a time now together this month when we look together at living with, at learning from the history of persons of color in this nation, in this empire, and particularly persons who identify as Black, African American, or another part of the African diaspora in the United States. And as comfortable as it might be to hold this history out in the way it might be written in a history book somewhere, or like a problem or an event to be analyzed, to be learned from or memorialized, an approach like that, frankly, won't do. It's not good enough. So Lord, oh Lord, what shall we do? That's a good question. I love, personally, that the blessings of music we enjoy each week come from a group called the Spirits. We have spoken together before about the way the word spirit comes from the same word as breath. And it takes divine breath to offer so often such beautiful music to our congregation. And for that, we are grateful to you all. So it's fitting today that we are singing, that we're listening to, we are loving the spirituals in this service. And as our order of service will tell you, many of these are called African American spirituals by the people who make and talk about music. These spirituals come to us as voices out of history, echoing into our own ears, maybe into our own hearts. But these songs, these spirituals, belonged first to another time. They arise out of another place. But to get there, to really get where these songs are, what they're doing in the world still, and what they have done for generations since, we have to go back, way back. In the beginning of God's creation of the heavens and the earth, now the earth was astonishingly empty, and darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the water. That is a translation of the first two verses of Genesis from the Hebrew Bible. The translation, I know, doesn't sound quite the same as many Bibles being published today. Bibles which seem to make the language sound tidy and good in English, rather than the original text in which it was written. The Hebrew Bible takes these two sentences to begin looking at what the Spirit can do. It's waiting, hovering over the face of the water. Maybe the Spirit was wondering, was asking, Lord, oh Lord, what should I do? Some people translate this rich text to say that the breath of God hovered over the deep, or over the abyss. Because as we mentioned, breath and spirit in both Hebrew and in Greek are used interchangeably. And so it is written by many from culture to culture, across continents and centuries, that the very breath of the divine was hovering over the waters, the deep, the emptiness, even before a single light was flung into the skies above. The Spirit came first. Breath comes first. Just like in any speaking we do to our neighbors, in any singing we do here or at home, the breath comes first. But it is written in the Hebrew Bible to tell the story of generations of people in the Middle East, to tell the story we tell and retell here every year at Passover, the story of release from bondage, a story of the Hebrew people's release from servitude, release from slavery. The entire next book of the Hebrew Bible is the story of Exodus, of escape from literal slavery under imperial rule. And that story was written and translated, transliterated over and over, in Bible after Bible, in verse after printed verse. A world of religious leaders, scholars, and students picked apart every translation, every text, every piece of knowledge about the story of our spiritual forebears being released from slavery and the joy that came from this exodus. They saw the power of God that could split a sea and free those bound in servitude and deliver them to freedom. All of this was written, and written well, in the history of God's people. And when a new world on a new continent across a sea parted by so many ships was founded, when those who knew the text, who were raised on their teachings, who could quote it chapter and verse, asked, "Lord, O Lord, what shall I do?" Somehow those people responded that they would trap, they would sell, they would profit from the very lives, the very breath, the very spirit of a people made to hover and wait over the face of an ocean, to reach a continent and to be consigned to a life of bondage and slavery. People of faith, people of conscience, people of God did this. And so it was that these acts that let the reading we heard today be written, we remember the words that were written by the great writer Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. "Ye who have laid your loved to rest and wept above their lifeless clay, know not the anguish of that breast whose loved were rudely torn away. Ye may not know how desolate our bosoms rudely forced apart, and how a dull and heavy weight will press the life drops from the heart." She is saying something many of us, myself included, don't like to hear. She is saying, you might not know what you are talking about. She writes to those who mourn and lose their beloveds, but who have the honor, the privilege to bury their beloveds and know where they rest. But her words tell us something else. She says something hard to hear, that death would be better, would be easier than what happens when another's love is taken, torn from them. The tearing apart ruptures the spirit and takes the very life force from their heart. And friends, I know it's not easy, but we've got to go here. Because whenever we are blessed with the chance to hear what comes from a fractured and broken spirit, to hear that warning, that death is easy compared to what I've seen, what I've felt, what I've lived, we have to honor the telling of that truth with our attention, with our care. That is the breath. That is the spirit. That is the total communion of souls that hover over the deep, deep truth. The still waters, the deepest messages of these songs, these spirituals, and they say together, at their root, death might be better. But before death came for these authors, words and music did. Longings of hearts in aching, emptying bosoms stretched across time and space, still connected, still longing when the words and music sprung forth to capture calls for freedom, for release, to sing of the Spirit longing for peace, longing for community, longing for family, longing at long last for God. And it is in this longing that each one of us, where the truth of these songs, where the Spirit moving over the waters of our souls hovers and waits, where we are each reminded of the question of the Spirit. Lord, O Lord, what should I do? And sometimes the answer comes like this. There is a balm in Gilead that makes the wounded whole. There is a balm in Gilead to heal the sin-sick soul. What lies between these lines? What calls first to the whole of those who were wounded, and then calls to the souls sick with sin, who may be wounding others. What calls to them both is the same thing. The wounded and the wounding together, a balm, a way of peace, a way of understanding. Because Gilead, in Hebrew, comes from combining the word for hill or mound, Gil, with the word witness, Ayad. And it was part of the lands into which Moses led the Hebrew people after being freed from slavery in Egypt. It is the promise. Gilead is the promise of a community of believers, a cloud of witnesses to freedom. It is the promise of a place of peace. It is the promise of being saved from a fate worse than death. Yeah, I said it. It's the promise of being saved. Yeah, I've gone and done it now. My friends, I have said the word saved from a Unitarian Universalist pulpit. So before the UU sermon police arrive to shut me down, I want to say a few more things while I've got you. There may not be a more loaded word than saved in religion these days. In the hands and the mouths of others, saved is often used like a spiritual litmus test by some religious people to determine who is in and who is out. I'm sure that virtually every person in this assembly today has been asked the question, are you saved? At some point in your lives. I grew up in Texas, so I'm happy to go up against any one of you. If we're going to do the numbers. Oh, invite him over for the weekend. Yeah, we'll go to church. Oh, you're Catholic? Oh, okay. Yeah, that definitely invite him over. One of the great quarrels in faith is with, one of my great quarrels in faith is with people who use the word in this way. Partly because I resent so much that such an important theological idea has been used to harm so casually so many that I love. When people are saved that way, it has more to do with morality or behaving ourselves, I think. Side note, when I did my 2-day intensive psychological analysis required to become a minister, I tested a little high on the amorality scale. But the psychologist looked at the front page that had my denomination on it, and he said, oh yeah, well, we see that a lot with Unitarians. True story. And I say, good. Because our faith, the Unitarian Universalist faith, is not a faith only of a morality written in one of many of the books set forth by any authority much farther away from our own conscience. We don't let our lives get written like that, friends. Ours is a faith that calls us into community, or if you will, a mound, or a heap. I know you all came here today thinking, I'm going to be in a heap today, but a mound or heap of witnesses concerned with the inherent worth and dignity of every life. But friends, it was not an easy road to get here, and it ain't over. And essential as it is to feel the truth of the inherent worth and dignity of every one of us today, we do not get to claim this mantle without also holding ourselves as witnesses to the testimony, to the memory that this faith is also an inheritor of a legacy that valued persons by their sale price on an auction block too. Millard Fillmore, who signed the Fugitive Slave Act that allowed the capture of people of color all over the free North was a Unitarian. You are not going to like this one. John C. Calhoun. It's okay. You can hiss. Ardent and vocal racist and defender of the institution of slavery right from the halls of Congress, also a Unitarian. And this legacy flows not only from these individual personalities. The principles, as if there were such a thing, of slavery, were debated in Universalist and Unitarian churches throughout a growing nation, with many northern-raised and educated ministers being assigned to southern churches where things did not go well. But it was a defining moment in the history of both of these faiths. Minds and voices, and yes, spirits of great import came from this debate, and we heard the bright, shining voice of Frances Ellen Watkins Harper proclaim to us the way that seemed like a debate to some was really and truly a crime of injustice of biblical proportions, literally, to others. Now, I don't know if any of you were watching TV this week, or if anyone else has heard of an example of where what seems like the law to some people is a flat-out crime to others. But welcome to church. It is out of this cauldron, of this seething debate, that so many of the truths of our own understanding, of our own souls, of our own spirits are found. For what better defines a group of people than how they follow their own rules? What better defines a religious group than how they care for the lives of those around them? Or perhaps best, what defines a life other than what it takes that life to survive? Death is easier than life sometimes, friends. Suffering of all kinds is all around us. It is in us. Just ask a Buddhist. Whether we are feeling a painful separation from family, whether we're suffering from things all around us, the ills of our society, whether it's addiction or whether it's mental health that seems like a long-forgotten dream for us, there are so many ways we feel the truth of not knowing what to do, where to turn. Lord, oh Lord, what shall I do? The answer hovers. When we inhale and begin to intone the words we sing, the answer moves on the breath to each one of our ears, where we can't help but feel the Spirit in this music, in our lives, because as someone much wiser than I said, dum spiro spero. Where there is breath, there is hope. I venture to say that those whose names are lost to time, the authors of what we sing today, who suffered so much to make the music we hear today that speaks to something maybe unconscious in our own hearts, would be honored in ways to know that we carry their writings into our very lives today. But we owe them more, I think, than honor. See, the only way to honor a gift that came from bondage is to find real freedom, real release, real liberation, real salvation. We must heal the broken hearts that carried these messages through the ages. We must imagine the unthinkable pain, the unknowable longing that drew these spirituals over the water in the first place, and what they still tell us today. We must find freedom, my friends, for you, for me, and for all those who live in bondage still. Then and only then can the history we know actually change. Then and only then can we let it be written that what we shout when the Spirit says shout. Let it be written that the wounded ones seeking to be made whole can meet one day the wounding ones with sick souls and find peace. And let it be written that each one of us, each one of our names, are called out from this faith of healing, of dignity, of strength, not merely to know justice, not merely to know peace, but to be saved. and to save. What should I do? Name in each one of us. Name in yourselves. What is that spirit that is hovering? What is that spirit that moves in us? That spirit that makes everything new again in us, in the world. And we give that spirit a name that means something to us. Mother, father, sister, brother, God, Yahweh, divine presence, time, fate, chaos, love. Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Church, friends. All of those names work. The question is, what should I do with it? And in the answer we hear, we might make a friend. We might make a visit to someone who is alone and frightened. We might make trouble.
Yeah.
That's one way we do it. But in the doing together, we might well make history. And in doing that, we may well be saved. May it ever be so. Blessed be, and amen.